Okay, here's something I see confused a lot of the time. It is the concept of heaven and hell, specifically the concept of heaven I want to talk about. So most people believe that, at least most people I've seen in my lifetime believe that through hard work, some form of dedication, good practice, repentance, and anything of that nature, toil, will get them a ticket to the pearly gates once they die, once they lose consciousness. And then they will forever be in the place of bliss, in absolution. That's the concept of heaven or hell, which is common. Okay. I would like to debunk that now. Now, I'm not the first one to ever try and debunk this. In my view, in my education, the person I've seen debunk this as one example is Freud, who said that religion is mass psychosis. And someone else said, for example, was it Marx said that religion is opium for the masses. In other words, it's a coping mechanism. So why are they saying that? Okay, because what I have to say has a lot to do with that. It's not a new thought, but I want to reframe it. First of all, I think heaven is a place on this world. In this world, it's a state of affairs that one can be in harmony with, I would say. Why do I believe that? I believe that because it's not necessarily consciousness that it's not necessarily your individual consciousness that gets to decide or control whether you or not you are in heaven, basically. So I'll put it this way. Let's say you're living a life that is in harmony with rules and regulations. In other words, your life is almost planned out for you in rigid calculation. Okay, you must not do this. You must never drink. You must never have sex before marriage. Well, these laws are, I would say, usually good, but let's just assume that we're being very rigid about them and we must follow them or else. There's no flex to it. When you live like that, then you would expect a reward almost for that repression. Because here's the thing, we have a natural urge, okay? So these laws exist. Why do they exist? Regulations exist because we do have natural urges, okay? So they're trying to protect us from ourselves. But here's the thing, if you never get to experience what that urge is, or at least somehow have an understanding, which is a blessing if you have understanding or not, by the way, because sometimes people are born with understanding. If you have an understanding, you can only see the value of a law like that once you have an inner understanding of what it's in place for. If you don't have an inner understanding of what a law is in place for, then you're slavishly following that rule. Now, why is this relevant? Because if you follow a rule and you don't necessarily understand why you're following the rule, then you're not doing it for yourself. You're not doing it for your existence and for your being, is what I would say. You're doing that for the satisfaction of your own mind because of a fear of a complex process that's going to take place if you do not follow that law. Do you understand what I'm saying? For example, if we dumbed it down and we made it about being in a swimming pool and not running by the side of a swimming pool. Let's say you're a young child and you don't understand that it's for your benefit to not run in the side, because let's say you don't understand that it's slippery. And I mean, it's a weak example because I think most kids would understand that, but let's say a kid doesn't understand. Think about then why, if it doesn't understand why it shouldn't and it still follows the regulation, think about this for a second. Why would it follow the law? I think the answer is, and I would wonder what you would think here naturally, but I would think that it's because of some punishment. And the only way you can expect to be punished is through a complex process in your mind, which tells you, if I do this, that will happen. Which isn't necessarily a part of being, a part of living and feeling and experiencing. That's a process that happens in the mind. It's a neural pathway. Do you understand? At least that's how I see it. And so, okay, so now what do neural pathways have to do with this? And I'm kind of freestyling here as well. Neural pathways, what they do is, let's say then you're in a religious environment and you have lots of these rules and regulations. So you have all of these neural pathways in your mind about how things should be and about certain outcomes which might happen to you, such as punishment or reward if you do or do not follow these regulations. Now, do you see how if it's all in your mind, it completely bypasses your being? It completely could theoretically bypass all understanding of why you would even follow the law or regulation in the first place. Let's say you're deathly scared of having sex before marriage. Then, if you're attracted to someone before marriage, you might beat yourself up completely as a consequence of what's happening in your mind, because you're afraid that it will lead to a breaking of that rule in your mind. But you see how it's all happening in your mind. And here I would say Descartes was wrong. The mind is not the seat of the soul. You think that because he said, I think, therefore I am. And that's true of a mental landscape, but it's not true of being, of the entirety of who we are, which you could conceive of an individual there. But even we are not really individuals, because we all come from a society, a community. Even if that community is incredibly fragmented, as it is in today's day and age. We all come from communities. We're all born in similar places. We're all born in, I have a hospital in common with certain people. I have my borough in common with certain people, the area I live in. I have my local area. So let's not disregard the fact that we all do come from a collective. So already, so it's not even clear really what is the one being punished or rewarded. Now, this idea of one is also a secondary point, which is incredibly important. Now, someone who believes that they need to live a life of toil or some kind of sacrifice to get into heaven or avoid hell, I'll say the statement clearly, that's selfish thinking. Because if someone is like that, they're thinking along the lines of, what's going to happen to me? They're thinking along the lines of, I'm in my head, which they are obviously, because they're living in all these regulations and they're constantly bound by these frameworks which occur in their mind. So they, against their own even understanding, I would say, and I know this because I've been through this and I still am in this to some extent, you are trapped in that framework, and so you're naturally selfish. And so you're always thinking of, because remember, why do you have all these frameworks? Because you want to avoid punishment, or you want to be rewarded. So it's all about you. So obviously, doesn't it make sense? Obviously, then it's going to be, then that individual who's thinking and believing that is going to believe that heaven or hell is something that happens to them, and it's something that would, and it's a question to be answered for when their consciousness goes black. Do you see how it's a selfish way of thinking? Because they're assuming that when the world goes black for me, when I lose my mind consciousness, because by the way, losing consciousness is only a mental thing. Okay, your body could well stay alive after you lose consciousness, or die, because I think that's what a lot of people mean by death. Which is an interesting topic, because Jesus, for example, does talk about everlasting life. But he doesn't mean that in the sense of consciousness, which is why a lot of people, which is I think why the whole cope came about actually in Christianity. But anyway, that's a separate topic. That's not worth talking about now. So what was I saying? The point really is, when you have that mindset, you think that it's going to happen to you. So obviously when you lose consciousness, that's your ultimate judgment. But that's very, not even necessarily selfish, it's just a limited view. It's a limited landscape. Limited landscape. Because, and I would suggest replacing that with a wider view of what is in actuality happening in, for example, your local area. Is the place heavenly? Is it hellish? And I think we all have a general sense for this. Like, do we live in a good area? Do we live in a bad area? But I think people sometimes don't make that jump to see themselves in the area and see themselves as responsible for their area. And it's something you kind of come to grips with, because you see people, you hear people talk about this is a bad area or this is a good area, and sometimes they live around that area, and I'm like, but don't you see that? Don't you see yourself as part of that area? Like, aren't you that area also? And don't you see yourself as responsible for this area? Like, if you're going to call the area bad and you live in that area, it's like, what are you doing what are you doing in that area? I'm not necessarily here to cast stones, and I think sometimes, and of course you should be allowed to, because I'm not trying to be dogmatic, you can obviously call your area bad if you're just going about your day and going about your business. But if you kind of litter, or like, if you don't look after your area and you don't mind its degradation, but then you blame it for being bad, it's a hellish thing, really. It's a hellish thing, because that's what hell is like. I mean, I'm now kind of tangenting a little bit, but that's what hell is, right? It's a place where everyone complains about, but no one does to help, so it gets worse. So you see how hell is. So that's why the idea of an absolute hell comes about, because I think people saw through it in that things can always get worse. You can always be even more selfish and even more disregarding and complaining and unhelpful, and it kind of just reaches this rock bottom, which is obviously a concept. Rock bottom is only a concept, but that's why the concept exists, because hell is a place where things get worse, whereas heaven is a place where things get better.